You may have seen them, the chilling new satellite images from Sudan. Mass graves, burned villages, entire communities erased.
Sudan is the site of the world's largest humanitarian crisis.
What the UN is calling the world's largest humanitarian crisis.
A lot of civilians have died in Sudan.
Tens of thousands have died. 13 million have been displaced.
Where more people die every day than Gaza and Ukraine combined.
A crisis long overlooked, suddenly impossible to ignore. For more than 2 years, Sudan has been engulfed in a brutal civil war, displacing millions and pushing entire regions towards famine. And yet, this crisis has remained largely hidden from public view, overshadowed by Ukraine, by Gaza, by every other crisis demanding the world's attention. So why has the world's largest humanitarian crisis slipped so far out of focus? And what will it take to bring Sudan back into view? Now, the Trump administration is signaling a fresh attempt to broker peace, and as Martin Griffiths, former UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, tells us,
ceasefires don't happen on the run. God knows we know that, don't we? And they don't happen when a war is new, and they don't happen when the generals are keen to fight.
With decades of experience mediating crises around the world, Griffiths knows what it takes to bring stability and aid to Sudan. I'm Leslie Vinjamori, President and CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and welcome to Deep Dish. Martin, you are well known to anyone who's ever come anywhere close to the world of conflict, violence, humanitarianism, and the United Nations. You have 5 decades of experience at the UN. Tell us about that period and what you were kind of contending with as the crisis heats up in Sudan.
I think what happened to me, as it were, when I arrived, the big power conflict here was Ukraine, is it started defining for me and everybody else that we're in a whole new world here. We have a permanent member of the Security Council invading and breaking the charter, invading its neighboring state. There was a very, very difficult set of negotiations on humanitarian access, which was still going on, I'm sure, through the war. And there was impunity. There was the beginnings of our current comprehensive experience of impunity, which, of course, has come through also in Sudan and the Middle East. So I think I was being slowly sort of boiled like a frog into realizing that, this is not going to be a great time. And in fact, when I left, by the way, I said publicly that I think I leave the world in a worse place than when I joined, and I'm damn sure that's right. But Ukraine epitomized it, as we know, but we didn't have the bandwidth at that time to really consider Sudan. Hardly made the news. And I think that the main victim of that was Sudan.
So you did this during the period of President Biden's leadership, so a different context.
Yeah, absolutely, very different.
So since April 2023, the conflict in Sudan breaks out. What is the immediate response? What is it that you tried to do in your role at the United Nations as this conflict breaks out? And how long does it take for you to understand the scale and significance of this conflict?
What I was struck by in the UN now, first of all, I wasn't actually a particular player in the first phase of this war, strangely enough. I was a member of the Executive Committee of the United Nations, reporting to the Secretary General who chaired it. And I remember attending many discussions about what to do. What I particularly remember was that we in the UN said we must have ceasefires. We've got to start with ceasefires. In fact, we've got a positive answer from so-and-so, and so we're on the road here. I felt instinctively from my mediation background, not least as well as humanitarian, this ain't so easy as that. Ceasefires don't happen on the run. God knows we know that, don't we? And they don't happen when a war is new. And they don't happen when the generals are keen to fight. So I felt at the first iteration of this that we were all on the wrong track.
But trying to get a ceasefire when the parties on the ground simply weren't ready and wanted to continue fighting.
That was the key thing. And we see it so often. I have such a lot of bad experience of failures of mine in that context in the past. So I kind of knew it in my soul. And instead, what one should do at that time, in an early war, You talk to the parties, you talk to the civilians who've just been ousted. You're starting to doing the heroes of Sudan during the war, the emergency rooms and others, into the conversation about what should be done. Now, of course, everybody says ceasefire because, of course, it's right. You stop people killing each other. It's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. But if it's not going to transpire soon, and it didn't, and I think still isn't, then we have to attend to the long haul. And the long haul is talking and inclusion and gender parity and in diversity and so forth. All the hard stuff that's not simply solved by a diplomatic meeting.
And so presumably building the coalition of people, an inclusive coalition, so that when the moment comes that there is an opportunity. But, this is the two problems, solving the problem of the conflict, but also dealing with the immediate, ongoing, devastating consequences. So tell us a little bit about how you have tried to address it. You're dealing at that point still with a multilateral system that clearly is, under challenge from multiple conflicts, but still has the commitment of the major Western powers and others. What were you able to do in that context in Sudan?
I was asked to go, first of all, to Nairobi and then to Port Sudan, Jeddah and Port Sudan, to get involved. And this was at the time of the remarkable and, on the whole, successful evacuation from Khartoum. Incredibly difficult political issue, but also a very difficult human issue. And also, it wasn't just about the UN staff leaving, it was about the Sudanese staying and being in need of assistance and protection. So I was brought in and I was sent to Jeddah, where the first Jeddah talks were happening. I was not allowed to attend the Jeddah talks, however, by the parties, because I would have been a distraction. But we were beginning to go into the needs phase at this point, and my job became much more relevant to the way the international community dealt with Sudan. And we began to see the problems that we still face throughout this appalling war. The lack of media attention because journalists don't get visas, the lack of funding. It still is a huge 1/3, I think, is funded this year of humanitarian projects. And the lack of access and, frankly, the lack of any insight into a formal. So that was where I came in and started doing my normal job, in effect, and not just an outlier. And it became a humanitarian issue for the UN more than a political one.
In part, presumably, because you didn't feel like you could get any political traction. But did you get the humanitarian traction? I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, it's 28% funded this year, so I'm learning. But back in the early year of the conflict, it was down about 19% funded, it being the humanitarian aid program. So massive response from the agencies, UN and international NGOs and local organizations. I mean, that's one of the great stories about Sudan, is local civil society, after all, and civilian leadership. But we never got the funding. Ukraine was the adversary, if you like, on this, because they get really good funding, and Europe went north, not south.
So the Europeans are preoccupied, I mean, understandably so.
Yeah.
And the rest of the world?
Very little response to Sudan and very little funding. And frankly, two things that didn't help that. One is no access was seriously provided by the parties. It was impossible, really seriously, in any proper effect, to go from Port Sudan to Darfur, across Sudan to deliver aid. People got killed on the way, convoys got bombed, and people didn't get what they needed. Secondly, there was this move to go to other conflicts, not least because, and here's the point, is the media absence. I learned perhaps mostly in Sudan, also a bit in Gaza, that the media makes all the difference. Well, I didn't understand it quite as clearly as I did in Sudan. We had people thrown out, humanitarian aid workers working for us, for the UN, thrown out of the country without any real controversy about it. And then finally, very quickly, in Jeddah, the first process where I was sitting, in the sidelines, the two parties signed this declaration of commitments to humanitarian principles. Neither of them have done virtually anything to honor those firm commitments they made. So that also downgraded their interest internationally, I think.
You know, Martin, there's something in what you've just said that I think is really important to draw out, because I think that sometimes people assume that the media wasn't there because the so-called international community didn't care about Sudan, a conflict in Africa. But you seem to be suggesting that they weren't there because they couldn't get access, not because they didn't wish to be there.
No, absolutely, clearly. And I had a lot of media journalists saying to me in a sort of apologetic way, we're trying to get this story on the news, but we don't have a story because we don't have access. We don't get visas. It was really down to as simple as that. And it still is. And, you know, I'm sorry to say that's a responsibility of the Sudanese government.
So, but here we are, right? The story hasn't consistently been on the front pages, but in recent days it has. So take us to the present moment. We now have what looks like a truly devastating set of atrocities committed. Can you explain your understanding of what's happened just in recent weeks?
I think what's happened is there's been an inflection point in the constant toing and froing of taking territory and losing it between these two parties, Sudanese armed forces and rapid support forces. And there was an inflection point which ended a 560-day siege, wasn't it, of El Fasher, with the takeover, the win of RSF. And that pitched the whole geography of the war in Sudan into a different place. And that has led, as we know, not just to the sequestering of El Fasher with, 150,000 people still there in desperate need and being administered by their enemies. But they're also going to Kordofan, both Kadugli and El Obeid. They're on the march. And you will remember that when RSF had taken Khartoum, in a sense, in the early days of the war, huge victory, they were now being pushed back in Khartoum in this last year or so by the Sudanese armed forces. So what we saw was a moment in the war in which the scales had shifted. RSF had talked about having a new government even in the western area, which was seismic. And it meant that the prospect for the victims of the Janjaweed, as I would put it, in those areas was really dire. And we needed to get to them, and we needed to get them out.
So when you talk about 150,000 people, you use a euphemism, being administered by their enemy. What you really mean, presumably, being subject to some of the most horrific atrocities imaginable. And this is getting media attention now.
It is.
So now that this has become front page news, what comes next? What response? Will it galvanize any kind of action? Or is it, back to where you started, that until the parties have the capability and wish to have a ceasefire, that there is no real capacity on the part of the international community?
Yeah, I think that's exactly where we are. We know that the atrocities happened. We have, thank God, this time, all these interviews with those who escaped to Tawila and other places. So it's perfectly clear. My successor, Tom Fletcher, along with the acting head of the World Food Programme, has been in that area, not in El Fasher. So it's unequivocally the case. And the fact-finding mission of the United Nations and the Human Rights Council, which looks at atrocities and human rights abuses in Sudan, has said very clearly that El Fasher is a crime scene. Remember, they reported that to the Human Rights Council in November, not long ago. It is a crime scene. And what they go on to say, back to your point about then what, they say atrocities can be reported, but they can't be pursued and accounted for without independent investigations. It's a banality in a way, but we see this not happening anywhere, and it's not happening in Sudan for one or two specific reasons. Neither of the two parties have any relationship with that fact-finding mission, never mind with other parts of the United Nations. They can't get visas either to go in, to conduct those investigations. Those investigations aren't happening. And what does that mean for us, all of us, including those who are members of the Security Council, is there has to be pressure, and it can be done. This is not a statement with the word should. It can be done. For example, the government of Sudan to let these people in. But the parties to be clear that giving humanitarian access, which is what the UN agencies are now pushing for, is not enough to, as you say, Leslie, so vividly, to allow the people in El Fasher and elsewhere not to be under the merciless oppression of their enemies. There was a Sudanese woman who talked to me recently in a meeting that we were having of activists on Sudan. And she said, how do we say to our brothers and sisters in al-Fasher that you don't worry, you've got a ceasefire, and we leave them to the mercies of these brutally and well-reported enemies? We have to monitor it. We have to get involved in it. It's not just a ceasefire in name. I think there are clear priorities in this way.
But, Martin, it does feel like the arrival of the second Trump administration materially, obviously, resources have been pulled, but also normatively, ethically, as a kind of guiding principle, that infusion of purpose into the international system has been ripped out. It would be helpful to understand, how you have seen both the kind of broad changes in this year of 2025 and also how it's impacted Sudan. So you leave before President Trump arrives, but you're deeply connected, obviously. Tell us what's happened to the world that you were in.
We have lost, and we here is the humanitarian community, but behind the humanitarian community is the international community, obviously, the guardians of law and principles. We have lost the war to insist on the relevance of common sense principles of accountability and against impunity. We have lost it everywhere. People are learning in conflicts around the world, small or big, to learn the lessons of Sudan and Gaza, and to a lesser extent of Ukraine, that don't worry, war is not a bad thing. You can have a go at it, if you're a general, of course, if you may win, and you won't go to jail, So the ways in which we contain bad behavior in the global norm period has kind of gone out the window. And that means that what the humanitarian community has done in a sort of very pragmatic response to this, but maybe with unintended consequences, it's gone for aid. It's gone for assistance. It's gone for funding. God knows there's nothing wrong with all those. It's essential. But it's doing that rather more than the idea of battling impunity and so forth. And part of this is fueled from years in which, for various good reasons, the humanitarian community has not been a partner of the human rights community. ICRC obviously is through the Geneva Conventions and so forth, but as a whole, it's an assistance community where protection, that concept, is the closest we get to talking about impunity and accountability.
Well, partly because of the access issues, right? The view that if you want access, you have to be quiet about the politics.
Exactly. And you don't want to make enemies where you don't need to, and you need to get aid in first. And there's very good reasons for this. But the clamor that the humanitarian community traditionally has been able to mobilize in many decades since the Second World War has not been as yet visible, and Sudan is the poster boy for that. Gaza obviously is. I think one of the problems for Sudan is it's been happening at the same time with Gaza, and there's always this kind of squeezy sense of which is worse. They're both awfully worse in very different ways in terms of levels of suffering and grievance. And I think we in the humanitarian community are on the back foot. We're hammered by cuts, and Tom Fletcher quite rightly talks about it all the time.
Say a little bit about those cuts, because what you've said is very interesting in this shift away from trying to contend with the fundamental problem of impunity and those who are committing mass atrocities. But even on the assistance side, there's just not so much left to deliver. In your time leading and since, how dramatic have those reductions been?
I think they've been much more dramatic than we've seen. They're huge cuts. But it's been overshadowed or overclouded, I think, by the fact that there's been a lot more money, but going to fewer conflicts and crises and issues. And so aid agencies built up large staffs, which are now being cut down because the money is not there, because it was a golden years, in a sense, up until earlier this year. And the other problem, I think, which is perhaps less discussed, is we don't hear about the consequences to ordinary people of those cuts. What happens to the 80% of people in Syria or the 70% of the people in Sudan who are not reached and aided and given succor? What happened? Did they die? Did they just move house? What was it? And traditionally, the humanitarian community has not wanted to go into this. because it's basically an inquiry into the heart of how they do triage, isn't it?
Too awful to account.
Yeah, too awful to account for. And you don't want to say you're playing God in so many of these places.
By which you mean choosing who to feed and who to protect and who to let die.
Yeah, and we have a huge issue in the humanitarian community, which I made key to my period there recently, which was listen to communities telling you what their priorities are. Don't do it on your own. And there's a big controversy within the humanitarian community about whether participation of communities and guiding your investment or assistance decisions are acceptable, because we all know the statistics about where people are in need. That's the alternative argument. We need to unpack a lot here, and it's not going to be easy or comfortable.
We know that America is in a very different position when it comes to leading on these issues. It doesn't feel like America is coming back into the fold anytime soon. Much easier to stay with what you have once you've cut. It's harder to kind of get people back on board. But there are other emerging powers. There's China, India, South Africa, Brazil. Is there any evidence that they intend to shore up the space that the U.S. is vacating? Is there leadership coming from others?
I mean, there's a lot of money in the world. As we constantly say, armaments expenditure last year was 2.1 trillion. We got 40 billion or something for humanitarian. So we know there's a lot of money if we could get our hands on it. My worry is that with these new donors, and they are new donors, and the Gulf is obviously, intrinsic to this, they don't have an instinct to go through the multilateral system, nor does the US anymore. I mean, the US is also talking about bilateral assistance with the US companies and so forth. So you don't have a great multilateral sense of obligation and duty. And this is compounded, I think, Leslie, by the fact that we, the UN, don't know enough about the values and principles and commitments of the Global South to these issues. We just don't know. We haven't asked them. There hasn't been a process which really clearly strikes to the heart of what we can expect from our new governors, essentially.
We haven't asked them. It's an extraordinary thing to say. At the United Nations, 4 years of G20 leadership by Global South countries, plenty of opportunity to have a conversation about this. Now, as we know, transferring to the U.S., UN General Assembly that's been very vociferous and active and robust in its engagement, and yet not a conversation about how they feel and what they wish to have. Now, I guess not a structured conversation.
Not a structured conversation, exactly. Of course, there's lots of conversation. The GA is a flourishing body, I think, an assembly coming to its time. Let's hope we will see more of it in the demise of the Security Council. But there's lots of conversations, but there's not a sense of purpose about discovering the answers to these questions, especially, for example, for we in the humanitarian community. What do they think about sovereignty? First of all, they have lots of different ideas. They're not a cohort, but they almost certainly feel sovereignty is a hard acquired right that they have fought for over these many decades. And sovereignty is in some ways an impediment to effective humanitarian aid, as we know in Sudan. And I don't think we had a structured debate within the UN Secretariat when I was there on this. Of course, watch the BRICS. This is Secretary General works in particular. But the broader community of the new powers, I don't think we really did in that sense. There were lots of evidence through interventions in the General Assembly and in the Human Rights Council and elsewhere, but it didn't become part of a collective determination to understand the strategic shift. I think that's the issue. And there are lots of initiatives, but it's just not quite got the edge I think it needs and the urgency it needs.
Well, the global context, highly fractured, very divisive. The sovereignty question, certainly an issue. But, the other thing, and curious your thoughts, again, as we close, a lot of the push for humanitarianism didn't come from people who were, busy in the day job of leading their countries. It comes from civil society, invested, infused through international organizations. It came from the U.S., but it didn't come from the presidents, per se. It came from those NGOs and others who kind of worked across borders with their like-minded colleagues to move things in the right direction. And so it does raise lots of questions about the role of civil society in the emerging powers of today. As you look ahead and you think about returning and to close with Sudan, because it is such an urgent and dire crisis situation, devastating for so many people, What, if you had to sort of prescribe to our listeners, of which, given it's you, Martin, there will be many, what would you recommend? How do you see your way through this, both in the short term, but also in the medium term?
We need a much, much more structured approach, this presumably through the Quad, but through civil society, as you just said, in the countries affected and the countries interested, to understand the role of civilian transition and the possibilities of that in Sudan. I'm struck by the fact that it is easy for the two parties and their supporters, by the way, of both parties, to keep telling us that military rule is out because they behaved so, oddly or whatever, but civilian transition is the thing. Both parties have said that. And the Emirates, for example, in the Security Council said it very clearly. And I was there a week or two ago when they said it very clearly to me. Don't worry about the generals, it's civil society transition. But there's no prospect of that happening without serious, deeply excavated efforts to get civil society consensus and leadership. And it hasn't happened. That's one. Number two, I think we have to have that ceasefire that we've been talking about, at least for Darfur and Kordofan, maybe not broader. Not least because it will actually be properly monitored, I hope, with robust monitoring, not just by humanitarian agencies, which is crucial, but by some equivalent of what is tried to be imagined in Gaza, some kind of monitoring force. I spent a lot of my time in monitoring over the many years, and you have to have it robust. In Indonesia, we had in Aceh, where we did a ceasefire through the Central Humanitarian Dialogue in earlier this century, we did it through Thai and Philippine military. You have to have military gravitas for this. And thirdly, we need to actually get the story out compellingly through independent investigations, as mentioned, but also through people like you and the media. This will make much more difference than everything else.
Martin Griffiths, a very difficult subject. Your experience and contributions have been tremendous. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Leslie. Thank you all.
And thank you for listening to this episode of Deep Dish on Global Affairs. I'm your host, Leslie Vinjamori. Talk to you next week. Deep Dish is a production of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to follow Deep Dish on Global Affairs wherever you get your podcasts. And if someone you know might find it interesting, send it their way. As a reminder, the opinions you heard belong to the people who expressed them and not to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. This episode is produced by Tria Raimundo and Jessica Brzeski, with support from Marty O'Connell and Lizzie Sokolich. Thank you for listening.